Well, here we are. I haven't had an episode number check-in for a while. Episode 12, I think it is, of Self-Care Shorts 2025. The season. Tis the season. The season of looking at these key ideas in this Pillars of Success for Social Workers book, which, as you will know now and be thoroughly bored with me saying, has actually got some good ideas in for everybody, even if you're not a social worker. So you buy a copy anyway, and just ignore the bits where it says social workers say this or do that, because what you'll find is, in your profession, if it's a person-facing profession or one that has a lot of bureaucracy attached to it, or report writing or whatever, or management of diaries and stuff, then the same things will resonate. So don't be put off by the social worker's title. You know what I mean? Be an honorary social worker for the day. So this time, we're going to talk about the 10-year plan. I called it the 10-year blueprint in the book. Your blueprint for the next 10 years. And the reason we need a 10-year plan is simple. You don't go on a big journey and not know where you're going. You know, I just spent some time a few weeks back in North Yorkshire, tiptoeing into the kind of, eastern side of the lakes, and my sons were out and about in their camper vans, wild camping, while we had a nice little cottage somewhere with a comfy bed, and they didn't just say, "Oh, tonight we're going to camp somewhere." Got on the apps and they found somewhere to camp, and they figured out where it was, and they figured out how they were going to get there, and they figured out what they might need when they got there, because having the plan of where to camp that night led them to do individual actions to make sure that the camp out was a success. So the 10-year blueprint gives you a lifelong vision, 10-year vision at least. But then you make another one. It gives you a lifelong vision, which then translates into daily actions. So imagine you've got this vision that is so compelling that it shapes every decision you make. So I'll give you two examples from my life, both of which have been long-term plans, if not quite 10-year plans sometimes. Actually, they have both been 10-year plans, roughly. I made a plan within about the first 2 or 3 weeks of it being in my social work education. I made a plan to eventually be a social work lecturer. I watched the other social work lecturers do their job, and I was so amazed by them and what they knew that I thought, that's what I want to be. I want to be like that. I was inspired by a good number of them, inspired by a good number of them who taught me, and Kate and Nigel, a couple of name checks there, inspired by these people to want to do what they were doing, and I decided then that if I was going to lecture in social work, I probably needed to be a social worker first, so I had something to say from a knowledge base. But when I got into practice, after I got myself settled in, I remember saying to my manager on the first supervision, maybe, I think she did the word see yourself in 3 years, and I said, sat there where you're at, not in an arrogant way, but just that's where I see myself. I see myself being in your position, because I wanted to get that full range of experience. And now, actually, one of the things I really love talking about and teaching is about organisational culture, leadership, and all that kind of stuff, because I wanted to do that bit as well, So I wanted to get experience of the social work role, and I wanted to get experience of the leadership management role, so I could then teach that stuff. So I did that, but it also triggered off other things. I volunteered to go into the university and do practitioner teaching sessions. I fed stuff back at team meetings, and I hated doing it because I was actually quite self-conscious about doing it. That imposter syndrome probably as well. What right have I got to be talking to these people who've been doing social work for so long? Imposter syndrome, we've talked about that before. But I did it, and I went through the discomfort, and honestly I hated it. I didn't sleep the night before some of those team meetings. And sometimes if my boss had said, just make sure you feed that back in the next few weeks, problematic, because I just left it, didn't I? Go, I'll do it next time, do it next time. In fact, sometimes I turned up at team meetings with the thing to feed back, and then didn't dare go, yeah, I've got something to feed back. And eventually I did, eventually I did the thing. And but I did those things because I had a 10-year plan to eventually be a lecturer in university. It took me about 12 years, I think, but eventually I got there, so a bit of a delay. So my next plan, which I compiled at the age of 50, was to end up making my living out of talking about and writing about this kind of stuff as a freelancer, not employed by somebody. And part of that was to write a book, make sure there was a book out to springboard into that. And I've done lots of those things, and I'm doing lots of those things, and I'm ready to maybe leave the university when I hit 60, which will be 10 years since the plan. And that created certain daily actions. I started writing a blog, and now I look back on some of my early blogs, and they're not very good. They're all right, look back on it, but I've improved, I've enhanced things. So creating a 10-year plan, crucially around your core principles, around what gives you meaning and purpose, articulating those long-term goals in a 10-year plan, which isn't a rigid thing. It has to move and shift and shape, but it gives you encapsulates your ideal future, your ideal future self. Where am I going to end up? What am I going to do? And then you break it down. Well, if I'm going to do that in 10 years time, what will I have needed to achieve by the 8-year point, by the 6-year point, by the 5-year point? And then you break that down. Well, all right, what do I need to achieve this year to get to that 2-year, 3-year point? Because things take time. I think the first book I wrote took about a year and a half to write, and it's not that thick, 130, 140 pages, something like that. It's not that, and 2 other people wrote a small number of the chapters with for me for that book, the co-authors on that. So I wrote most of it myself, I suppose, apart from I think 3 or 4 chapters maybe, but still it took a year and a half. So you've got to what's my target? So my target wasn't to write a book. My target was to write a book, but then that was broken down into, well, over the next 2 weeks I'll write this chapter, or I'll draft the chapter, and then I'll draft the next chapter, and then I'll draft the next chapter, then I'll go back to the first chapter and rewrite that, and on you go. So you have the 10-year plan, and maybe you break that down into a 5 or a 3-year plan. You think, what do I need to get there? Where do I need to be by here? And then you break it down into an actionable yearly plan. And it might be about personal growth, professional growth. It might be about cultivating relationships. Cultivating mentor. Get mentors on board. My friend Paul was a great mentor then around working the social media and the blogs and that kind of thing. So all of that kind of stuff, you're breaking it down, and so then you break down that annual thing into weekly things, and then you break those weekly things down into daily things. And all right, yeah, most days you've got to get on and do the job, but if you can do something every day or every few days that work you towards the long-term plan, then you turn that largely abstract dream, gradually you turn it in small steps into a reality, embracing the long term. And I do think this is one of the problems we've got in the modern world. Short-termism in many things, politics, business, all that kind of thing, and in the tasks we set ourselves to lead fulfilling lives. If nothing's happened in a week or a fortnight now, we think it's all been a disaster. Well, no, do you know what I mean? I've been teaching myself to draw on and off for years, and I haven't been at it for years. I've had little pockets of time. And now my easel's been set up there for, the last, I got that at Christmas, but I was drawing before then as well. And am I getting better? Well, a little bit, but not radically, because it'll take a long time, and it's fine. Enjoy the journey. You know, enjoy the journey. That's the kind of key thing. So embrace the long-term perspective by breaking your 10-year vision, if you like, down into small steps, working towards something, having a long-term plan that gives your life that purpose, that meaning, and gives us some sort of balance between achieving short-term objectives but also achieving long-term objectives, you know, or working towards long-term objectives. And that gives you, and I've ended this little section in the book by saying, gives you enduring fulfillment. And that's brilliant. All right, see you next time.